Stay in your place, Mr. Mandela. You are not here to teach anyone anything. This court decides who you are. An entire state summed up in a single sentence. No crime was being judged there. An existence was on trial. The problem was that on that day, the accused man decided to explain to the world who was really being judged. April 20th, 1964. 10:17 a.m. The Supreme Court of Pretoria was packed wall to wall. Every seat filled, people standing in the aisles. Outside, thousands more waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of what everyone knew would be historic. Inside, at the defendant's table, sat Nelson Mandela, charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the state. The prosecution was calling for the death penalty. The all-white jury had already made up their minds. Everyone in that room knew how this would end, except they didn't. Because what happened in the next 4 hours wouldn't just be a trial, it would be a masterclass in turning oppression into ammunition. Judge Quartus de Wet entered the courtroom. He was exactly what you'd expect from apartheid South Africa's judiciary, a man who'd spent his entire career upholding laws designed to crush people like Mandela. He looked at the defendants with the kind of contempt you reserve for insects, the kind of look that says you're not even worth the effort of hate. Just disgust. Pure, simple disgust. The clerk called the court to order. Judge de Wet settled into his high-backed chair, adjusted his robes and picked up the indictment. He cleared his throat and began reading the names of the accused. When he reached Mandela's name, he paused. Then he did something that would echo through history. He smirked, not a smile, a smirk, that particular expression of mockery that needs no translation in any language. And then he spoke. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. He stretched out the middle name, Rolihlahla, dragging each syllable like it was something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. Roli, hale, hale. Several people in the courtroom laughed, not nervous laughter, real laughter. The kind that comes from people who think they're watching a comedy, not a trial that would determine whether a man lives or dies. Judge de Wet didn't stop them. He just looked at Mandela with that same smirk and said, "What does that even mean? Is that supposed to be a name?" The interpreter, required by law to translate everything, hesitated. You could see him calculating. Do I translate this mockery? Do I soften it? In the end, he translated it word for word. The black spectators in the segregated gallery went silent. Not the silence of fear, the silence of rage being held back by the thinnest thread of self-control. Mandela sat perfectly still. His face showed nothing. No anger, no humiliation, nothing. He'd learned that control in his years as a lawyer, refined it in his years as an activist, and perfected it in the months he'd already spent in prison. He knew something Judge de Wet didn't. In a system designed to dehumanize you, showing emotion is giving your oppressor exactly what they want. So Mandela waited. He waited through the reading of the charges. He waited through the prosecution's opening statement, where they called him a terrorist, a communist, a threat to civilization itself. He waited through 3 hours of testimony designed to paint him as everything except what he was, a man fighting for his people's freedom. And then, when it was his turn to speak, when the court clerk asked if he had anything to say before sentencing arguments began, Mandela stood up. The courtroom went silent again. Different silence this time. Anticipation. Judge de Wet looked at him with barely concealed irritation. "Keep it brief, Mr. Mandela. We have a schedule to maintain." Mandela didn't acknowledge the judge's words. Instead, he turned to face the gallery. All those people packed into that courtroom, black faces separated by law from white faces, all of them waiting to see what he would do. And Mandela spoke. "My lord." His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who'd practiced law in these very courts before the government banned him from practicing. "My lord, before this court passes sentence, I believe the court should hear what my name means. Because names, my lord, carry meaning, they carry history, they carry truth." Judge de Wet's smirk faded. He hadn't expected this. The prosecution hadn't expected this. This wasn't how defendants spoke in apartheid courts. "You apologized, you begged for mercy, you accepted your place. You didn't give history lessons." Mandela continued, Rolihlahla. "In Xhosa it means troublemaker." Judge de Wet blinked. The courtroom, which had been silent, became something beyond silent. Every person leaning forward, even the ones who'd laughed earlier, now paying complete attention. "My father named me Rolihlahla," Mandela said, "because from the moment I was born I questioned things that should not be questioned. I pulled on branches that should not be pulled. I disturbed the order of things that should not be disturbed." He paused. Let that sink in. Then he looked directly at Judge DeWitt. "So when this court mocks my name, when it treats my language as something less than language, when it laughs at the culture of my people, it proves exactly why I stand here today. Because I am Rolihlahla. I am a troublemaker, and I will keep troubling this system until it breaks, or until it breaks me." You could hear people breathing. That's how quiet it was. Judge DeWitt's face had gone from contemptuous to something else. Not quite fear, not quite respect. Something in between. The realization that he'd made a mistake, that he'd given Mandela an opening, and Mandela had driven a truck through it. But Mandela wasn't finished. "You asked what my name means, my lord, so let me tell you about names. Let me tell you about the names you won't find in your indictment, the names of children who will never go to proper schools because of the color of their skin, the names of men who carry passes like criminals in their own country, the names of women who watch their husbands taken away in the night for the crime of wanting to live as human beings. Those names, my lord, they fill volumes. They fill graves. They fill the history that you and this court choose to ignore." Judge DeWitt tried to interrupt. "Mr. Mandela, this is not the time for political speeches." Mandela didn't raise his voice, didn't get angry, just kept that same measured tone. "My lord, you made my name political when you mocked it. You made this trial political when you charged me with fighting for freedom. Everything in this courtroom is political. The only question is whether we have the courage to admit it." The prosecution was on their feet now, objecting, demanding that Mandela be held in contempt. But here's what they didn't understand. Mandela wanted contempt. Contempt meant the world would see this trial for what it was. Contempt meant international attention. Contempt meant the story would spread. Judge DeWitt knew it too. You could see him calculating. Hold Mandela in contempt, and you make him a martyr. Let him continue, and you lose control of your own courtroom. Either way, you lose. So DeWitt did the only thing he could do. He tried to move on, tried to pretend the moment hadn't happened. "Your statement is noted, Mr. Mandela. Now, if we can return to the matter at hand." But it was too late. The entire dynamic of the trial had shifted. See, what happened next is what makes this moment so powerful, because Mandela didn't just defend himself. He put the entire apartheid system on trial. For the next 3 hours, he spoke. Not as a defendant begging for mercy. As a prosecutor laying out his case. He talked about the Sharpeville massacre, where police opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing 69 people, most of them shot in the back as they ran away. He talked about the pass laws that required every black South African to carry documentation, proving they had permission to exist in their own country. He talked about the Bantu Education Act, designed specifically to give black children an inferior education so they'd be fit only for manual labor. He talked about forced removals, where entire communities were bulldozed to make room for white suburbs. He talked about the wages, how black miners doing the same work as white miners earned 1/10 the pay. And with each fact, each statistic, each story, he wasn't defending himself. He was indicting them. The prosecution kept objecting. The judge kept trying to maintain order. But the gallery kept listening. And beyond the gallery, beyond the courtroom, the reporters kept writing. By the time Mandela finished speaking, every major newspaper in the world had the story. Not the story the apartheid government wanted them to have. Mandela's story. And here's the thing about Mandela's strategy that day. It wasn't just brilliant rhetoric. It was chess played at the highest level. Because Mandela knew he was going to be convicted. The trial was a formality. The verdict was written before he ever walked into that courtroom. But conviction wasn't the same as defeat. Let me take you back 6 months, to October 1963, before the trial even started. Mandela was already in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for incitement and leaving the country illegally. He knew more charges were coming. Knew the government was building a case that would put him away for life, or put him in front of a firing squad. His lawyers, Bram Fischer and George Bezos, came to visit him in his cell. They had a strategy: plead guilty to some charges, negotiate others, try to avoid the death penalty. It was sound legal advice, the kind any reasonable lawyer would give, the kind that might actually keep their client alive. Mandela listened to everything they said. Then he said no. Bram Fischer leaned forward. "Nelson, they want you dead. This isn't about winning. This is about surviving. If we fight every charge, if we turn this into a political platform, they'll have no choice but to execute you to make an example." Mandela's response was calm, measured, the same tone he'd use in that courtroom 6 months later. "Then they make an example of me. But they do it while the world watches. They do it while I tell the truth about this system. Because if I'm going to die, Bram, I'm going to die standing up. Not on my knees begging for mercy from a system that has no mercy to give." Fischer knew Mandela well enough to know when an argument was lost. So instead, they built a different strategy. They'd use the trial itself as a platform. They'd call witnesses. They'd present evidence. They'd turn the courtroom into a stage, and Mandela would be the lead actor, director, and writer all at once. But even Fischer didn't fully understand what Mandela was planning until that moment with Judge de Wet and the name. Because that moment, that single exchange about Rolihlahla, it did something genius. It humanized Mandela in a way that no amount of testimony could. Before that moment, to white South Africans, to much of the world, he was an abstraction, a terrorist, a communist, a threat. After that moment, he was a man with a name that meant something, a man with a culture, a man with dignity, and you can't execute dignity as easily as you can execute an abstraction. The prosecution understood this too late. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage was done. Dr. Percy Yutar, the lead prosecutor, was a complicated figure himself. A Jew in apartheid South Africa, he'd faced discrimination, knew what it felt like to be treated as less than. But he'd chosen to serve the system anyway, maybe thinking he could prove his loyalty, maybe thinking he could rise above his own oppression by oppressing others. Whatever his reasons, he'd built his case meticulously. Months of investigation, hundreds of documents, witness testimony. On paper, it was airtight. In reality, it was full of holes, because it was built on the assumption that Mandela would behave like a normal defendant, that he'd try to minimize his actions, distance himself from the sabotage, claim he was just a figurehead. Instead, Mandela did the opposite. He admitted to everything. Every charge of sabotage, every act of resistance, every plan to undermine the apartheid state. He admitted to all of it. And then he explained why. Not as justification, as indictment. "I do not deny that I planned sabotage," Mandela told the court. "I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by whites." He walked them through the history, how peaceful resistance had been met with violence, how non-violent protests had been met with massacres, how every legal avenue had been systematically closed, how every attempt at negotiation had been rejected, how the government itself had made violence inevitable by refusing every other option. It wasn't an apology, it was a closing argument in a trial where he was the prosecutor and the apartheid state was the defendant. And it was working. You could see it in the faces of the international journalists. You could see it in the faces of the younger white spectators, the ones who hadn't yet had all the empathy beaten out of them by the system. Hell, you could even see it in some of the guards, the way they wouldn't quite meet Mandela's eyes anymore. Judge de Wet tried everything to regain control. He interrupted. He threatened to clear the courtroom. He held sidebar after sidebar with the prosecution, trying to figure out how to shut Mandela down without making it obvious they were afraid of what he was saying. Nothing worked, because Mandela understood something fundamental about power. Real power doesn't come from the ability to silence others. Real power comes from the ability to speak truth in the face of those trying to silence you. And every time they tried to shut him down, every time they interrupted or objected or threatened, they proved his point more effectively than any speech could. The trial lasted from October 1963 to June 1964. 8 months of testimony, evidence, arguments. But everyone who was there, everyone who followed it, they all point back to that one moment, that one exchange about a name, because that moment changed everything. It changed how the world saw Mandela, how the world saw the trial, how the world saw apartheid itself. Before that moment, apartheid was this distant thing, this policy that maybe seemed reasonable if you didn't look too close, if you believed the propaganda about separate but equal, about cultural differences, about maintaining order. After that moment, after the world watched a judge mock a man's name and watched that man turn that mockery into a mirror reflecting the ugliness of the entire system, you couldn't look away anymore. You couldn't pretend not to see. June 11th, 1964. The day of sentencing. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been on opening day. Everyone knew this was it: life in prison or death. Those were the only options on the table. Judge DeWitt entered. The courtroom rose. He sat. They sat. He cleared his throat and began to read. The crime of which the accused have been convicted, that is the main crime, the crime of conspiracy, is in essence one of high treason. The state has decided not to charge the crime in this form. Mandela sat perfectly still, face neutral, giving nothing away. The sentence in the case of all the accused will be one of life imprisonment. Not death, life. The courtroom erupted, cheering from the gallery, shouting from the prosecution, chaos from every direction. Judge DeWitt banged his gavel, calling for order, but his voice was lost in the noise. And Mandela, he just sat there, the same calm expression he'd had throughout the entire trial. Later, people would ask him about that moment. Did you think you'd get death? Did you think you'd be executed? And Mandela always gave the same answer. I was prepared for death, but I was also prepared to live. Because the fight doesn't end with one man. It doesn't end with one trial. It continues until freedom is won. The international reaction was immediate and massive. The United Nations Security Council called for Mandela's release. Countries around the world imposed sanctions on South Africa. The trial, and specifically that moment with the name, it became a rallying cry. Free Mandela became one of the most powerful slogans of the 20th century. Concerts, protests, campaigns, all centered around a man the apartheid government thought they'd silenced by putting him in prison. Instead, they'd created a symbol more powerful than any free man could have been. Mandela would spend the next 27 years in prison. First on Robben Island, breaking rocks in a limestone quarry, then at Pollsmoor Prison, then at Victor Verster. 27 years of his life taken from him. 27 years away from his family, his friends, his country. But here's what the apartheid government never understood. You can imprison a man, you can take away his freedom, you can lock him in a cell and throw away the key, but you can't imprison an idea. You can't lock up dignity. You can't silence truth. And Mandela had planted that truth in that courtroom in April 1964. He'd planted it with a single sentence about his name. And it grew. It grew through the years of his imprisonment. It grew through the international pressure. It grew through the internal resistance movements that refused to stop fighting. It grew until the entire apartheid system collapsed under the weight of its own injustice. February 11th, 1990. After 27 years, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison a free man. Millions watched on television. The whole world stopped to see this moment. 4 years later, in 1994, he became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The man they'd tried to break, the man whose name they'd mocked, became the leader of the nation. And one of his first acts as president? He invited Judge DeWitt to tea, not as revenge, as reconciliation. Because Mandela understood something that his oppressors never could. The goal wasn't to defeat white South Africa. The goal was to free everyone, including the oppressors, from the system that dehumanized all of them. Judge DeWitt declined the invitation. He died a few years later, never having publicly acknowledged his role in the trial, never having addressed that moment when he mocked Mandela's name. But history doesn't need his acknowledgement. History has already made its judgment. That moment in the courtroom, that exchange about a name, it's taught in law schools now. Not as a legal strategy, though it was brilliant strategy, but as something more important, as an example of how dignity itself can be a weapon, how truth can be more powerful than any army, how a single sentence spoken with courage and clarity can change the course of history. Students studying the trial always ask the same question. What would have happened if Mandela had just ignored the mockery? If he'd let it slide, focused on the legal arguments, tried to win on technical grounds? And the answer is simple. He would have lost. Maybe not the trial itself, he was going to lose that anyway. But he would have lost the larger fight. He would have accepted the premise that his name, his culture, his people were less than, that they deserved mockery, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity the system chose to give them. Instead, he did something radical. He claimed his dignity. He didn't ask for it, didn't beg for it, just claimed it as his right. And in doing so, he showed millions of people around the world that they could claim theirs too. That's the real power of that moment. Not that it changed Judge DeWitt's mind, it probably didn't. Not that it won the trial, it didn't. But that it showed what resistance looks like when you refuse to accept the terms your oppressor sets for you, when you refuse to play their game by their rules, when you turn their weapons against them. Mandela turned that courtroom into a weapon. He used their own system, their own procedures, their own need to appear legitimate in front of the world, and he weaponized all of it. Every rule they'd made to ensure conviction became a platform for truth. Every attempt to silence him became proof of his argument. Every day of the trial became another day the world watched and saw apartheid for what it really was. The prosecutors knew it. You can see it in the trial transcripts, the way they became more desperate as the days went on, the way they kept trying to limit Mandela's testimony, to control what he could say, to frame the narrative. The judge knew it. That's why he kept trying to move things along, to wrap it up quickly before Mandela could do more damage. The government knew it. That's why they'd wanted to execute him quickly, quietly, before he became too powerful a symbol. But they couldn't. Because the world was watching. And once the world was watching, once that spotlight was on, they couldn't use their usual methods. They had to pretend to follow their own rules. They had to pretend to care about justice. And that pretense, that small crack in the armor of apartheid, that's what Mandela exploited. There's a photograph from that trial. You've probably seen it. Mandela and his co-defendants, fists raised in the Black Power salute as they're led back to their cells after sentencing. Every face determined, defiant, unbroken. That photograph traveled around the world. It was banned in South Africa, of course. Possessing it could get you arrested. But it spread anyway, copied and recopied, passed hand to hand, hidden in books and under floorboards, because it captured something essential. It showed that you could put men in chains, but you couldn't make them accept those chains. You could convict them, but you couldn't make them guilty. You could take their freedom, but you couldn't take their humanity. And that image, combined with the story of what happened in that courtroom, it became fuel for the resistance movement. Every time someone got tired, every time someone thought maybe fighting was pointless, someone would tell them about Mandela turning the trial into a weapon. About how a single sentence changed everything. Students of history often make the mistake of thinking that great moments happen suddenly. That change comes like lightning, unexpected and immediate. But that's not how it works. That moment in the courtroom didn't change everything overnight. Apartheid lasted another 30 years after Mandela went to prison. Thousands more would die, millions more would suffer. But the seed was planted. The crack in the wall had appeared. And once you see the crack, you can't unsee it. You know the wall can fall, you know it's not eternal, not inevitable, not natural, just a wall. And walls built by human hands can be torn down by human hands. That's what Mandela understood standing there in that courtroom. He wasn't trying to win the trial. He was trying to show that the wall could fall, that it would fall, that it was already falling, even if nobody else could see it yet. By the time he walked out of prison 27 years later, the wall was rubble. The system that had seemed so permanent, so powerful, so inevitable, was gone. And in its place was the beginning of something new, imperfect, difficult, painful in many ways, but new and possible. That possibility, that's what came from a single sentence about a name. But let's talk about what that sentence cost. Because stories like this, they get simplified over time. They become legends, inspiration, motivation, and that's important. But the truth is messier and more painful. Mandela's decision to turn that trial into a weapon, it came with a price he paid, a price his family paid, a price his entire movement paid. When Mandela chose to defy the court, when he chose to speak truth instead of seeking mercy, he knew what he was choosing. He was choosing 27 years in prison. He was choosing to miss his children growing up. His daughter Zinzi was 3 years old when he went to prison. She was 30 when he got out. He missed her entire childhood, her teenage years, her young adulthood. He missed everything. His wife Winnie, she paid a price too. She became a target. The apartheid government, furious that they couldn't break Mandela, they went after her instead, arrested her repeatedly, banished her to remote towns, tortured her, tried to break her spirit the way they couldn't break his, and sometimes they succeeded. Winnie Mandela's story is complicated, filled with pain and anger and decisions made under impossible pressure. That's part of the price too. The movement paid a price. Because while Mandela was in prison, unable to lead directly, the struggle continued. People died. Soweto uprising in 1976, hundreds of schoolchildren shot by police for protesting the imposition of Afrikaans as the language of instruction. Sharpeville, Langa, Uitenhage, township after township, where people stood up and were cut down. Each death, each shooting, each imprisonment was part of the price of that dignity Mandela claimed in that courtroom. So when we tell this story, when we talk about how powerful that moment was, we need to remember that power came at a cost. It wasn't free. It wasn't easy. It wasn't some clever trick that magically solved everything. It was a choice to pay the price for dignity instead of accepting the false comfort of submission. And that's what makes it truly remarkable. Not that it was easy, but that knowing how hard it would be, how much it would cost, Mandela chose it anyway. The guards on Robben Island, they had orders to break him, to make him regret his defiance. They put him in the worst cell, made him do the hardest labor, gave him the least food. They tried to make him invisible, prisoner number 46664, not a name, just a number. But Mandela refused invisibility. Even in prison, he organized. He taught other prisoners, turned the isolation section into what became known as Mandela University. He studied Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, not to submit to them, but to understand them better. He read their poetry, their history, their philosophy. He knew that you can't defeat an enemy you don't understand, and he understood that the guards themselves were trapped in the system too. Many of them were poor whites, Afrikaners who'd grown up being told that their whiteness made them superior, that they had a divine right to rule over blacks. But prison guard wages were terrible. Their lives were hard. They were exploited too, just in different ways. Mandela saw that. He treated even the cruelest guards with a dignity they didn't deserve and hadn't earned. Not because he was naive, not because he was weak, but because he understood that the system needed everyone to hate, needed everyone to dehumanize each other. And by refusing to hate, by refusing to dehumanize even his oppressors, he was attacking the foundation of the system itself. Some guards responded to it. Not all. Some remained cruel until the end. But some, slowly, started to see him as human, started to see themselves as human too, not just instruments of oppression, started to question the system they served. One guard, Christo Brand, later became friends with Mandela, wrote a book about their relationship, talked about how Mandela changed his understanding of the world. That was part of the strategy too. Every person who saw Mandela as human, instead of as a number, as a terrorist, as a threat, that was another crack in the wall, another seed planted. The international campaign to free Mandela grew throughout the 70s and 80s. Concerts, protests, sanctions. Free Nelson Mandela became a chant heard around the world. Young people in London, New York, Tokyo, they wore Free Mandela t-shirts. They organized boycotts of South African products. They pressured their governments to take action. The South African government tried everything to stop it. They banned his image. They banned his words. They banned even mentioning his name in public. But you can't ban an idea. You can't unpublish the truth. The trial transcript, smuggled out of South Africa, published around the world, It kept spreading that truth. Mandela's words from that courtroom reached millions of people who would never set foot in South Africa, and each person who read those words had to make a choice. Do I believe the propaganda that this man is a terrorist? Or do I believe my own eyes reading his testimony, seeing his dignity, understanding his fight? Most chose to believe their eyes. The economic pressure mounted. Companies pulled out of South Africa. Banks refused to do business with the apartheid government. Sports teams were banned from international competition. South Africa became a pariah state, and all of it traced back in some way to that trial, to that moment when Mandela turned humiliation into dignity, turned a courtroom into a weapon. By the mid-1980s, even the apartheid government knew they had a problem. They offered Mandela conditional release multiple times. He could go free if he renounced violence, if he agreed to stay out of politics, if he acknowledged that he'd been wrong. Every time, Mandela refused. He sent messages out through his daughter Zinzi. Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts. I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. That refusal, it cost him years of freedom. He could have been out of prison in 1985, could have seen his grandchildren grow up, could have had a decade more of his life. But he understood something crucial. If he accepted conditional freedom, he'd be legitimizing the system that imprisoned him. He'd be accepting that the government had the right to set terms for his humanity, so he stayed in prison, and the world kept watching. P.W. Botha, the president of South Africa, called him the most dangerous man in the country. And he was right. Not because Mandela had weapons, he didn't. Not because he commanded an army. He couldn't. He was in prison. He was dangerous because he represented something the apartheid system couldn't tolerate. The possibility that black South Africans were fully human, deserving of full rights, equal to whites in every way. As long as that possibility existed, as long as Mandela lived and breathed and stood firm, the system was vulnerable. Eventually, the pressure became too much. The economy was collapsing. International isolation was complete. Internal resistance was growing. Townships were becoming ungovernable. The cost of maintaining apartheid was exceeding the benefits, even for those who profited from it. F.W. de Klerk became president in 1989. He was no liberal hero. He was a pragmatist who understood that apartheid was failing, that continuing it would lead to a civil war South Africa couldn't win. So he made the calculation. Release Mandela, negotiate, try to maintain as much power as possible in whatever came next. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk announced that Mandela would be released. 9 days later, on February 11th, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. He was 71 years old. He'd been in prison for more than a quarter century. The world expected to see a broken man. Instead, they saw Mandela, still standing tall, still dignified, still unbroken. His first public speech after release, he gave it from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets. The speech was broadcast live around the world. And Mandela, he picked up exactly where he'd left off 27 years earlier. He talked about the struggle, about the need for negotiation, but also the need to maintain pressure. About the goal of a democratic South Africa where all people, regardless of race, could live in freedom and equality. He didn't talk about revenge, didn't call for punishment of those who'd imprisoned him, didn't demand retribution for 27 years stolen from his life. Instead, he talked about reconciliation, about building a new South Africa together, about moving forward without forgetting the past. The negotiations that followed were complex, difficult, often seeming on the verge of collapse. There were those in the apartheid government who wanted to maintain white power under a different name. There were those in the liberation movement who wanted to punish every white South African for the crimes of apartheid. Mandela navigated between these extremes. He negotiated, compromised when he could, stood firm when he had to. He brought the entire country through a transition that could easily have become a bloodbath. In 1993, he and F.W. de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize. It was controversial. Many felt that de Klerk didn't deserve recognition for dismantling a system he'd spent his entire career supporting. But Mandela understood that peace required acknowledging that former enemies had chosen a different path. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Black South Africans, many of them in their 70s and 80s, stood in lines for hours, sometimes days, to vote for the first time in their lives. They wept as they cast their ballots, wept for the friends and family who didn't live to see this day, wept for the decades of struggle that had finally led here. Mandela won with 62% of the vote. He became President of South Africa on May 10, 1994. His inauguration was attended by the largest gathering of foreign dignitaries in history. Everyone wanted to be there for this moment. The terrorist became the president. The prisoner became the leader. The man whose name had been mocked became the symbol of freedom for the entire world. His presidency focused on reconciliation and transformation. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The idea was radical. Instead of trials and punishments, offer amnesty to those who fully confessed their crimes under apartheid. Let the truth be told. Let the victims be heard. Let the perpetrators acknowledge what they'd done. Then move forward together. It was imperfect. Many victims felt betrayed, felt that justice demanded punishment. Many perpetrators never confessed, never acknowledged, never faced any consequences. But it prevented the cycle of revenge that had torn apart so many other post-conflict societies. Mandela served one term as president, 5 years. Then he stepped down voluntarily, setting a precedent for democratic transitions in Africa, where so many liberation leaders had become dictators. He spent his remaining years advocating for peace, for AIDS awareness, for education. He died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. The entire world mourned. Presidents and paupers, celebrities and ordinary citizens, everyone recognized that someone extraordinary had passed. Someone who'd changed history through the force of his dignity, his courage, his unwavering commitment to justice. But here's what often gets lost in the legend. Mandela wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. His first marriage failed, destroyed by the pressures of activism and imprisonment. His second marriage to Winnie ended in divorce, their relationship unable to survive the trauma they'd both endured. He sometimes compromised when he should have stood firm when he should have compromised. The economic transformation of South Africa that he'd envisioned never fully materialized. Decades after apartheid's end, South Africa still struggles with massive inequality, poverty, corruption. The problems are different, but still enormous. Mandela knew all this. In his later years, he talked about it openly, about the disappointments, the failures, the ways that freedom hadn't lived up to its promise for many South Africans. But he never lost faith in the possibility of progress. Never stopped believing that dignity was worth fighting for. Never regretted the choices he'd made, including that choice in the courtroom in April 1964 to turn mockery into power. So here's the lesson, the thing that makes this story more than just history. Power protects itself through humiliation, through making you accept that you're less than, that you deserve less, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps they give you. And the most radical act of resistance is refusing that humiliation, not with violence, though sometimes violence becomes necessary, not with anger, though anger is justified, but with dignity, with the simple, profound act of saying, "This is my name, this is who I am, and I will not let you make me less." Judge Quartus de Wet thought he was in control that day. He thought he could mock a man's name and face no consequences. He thought the trial would be a formality, a rubber stamp on decisions already made. He thought he had all the power. He was wrong. The power was never his. It was Mandela's. It had always been Mandela's. Because true power doesn't come from the ability to mock others. It comes from the ability to stand unmocked in the face of mockery, to remain human when others try to make you less, to turn every weapon they use against you into a weapon of your own. That's what happened in that courtroom in Pretoria in April 1964. A judge mocked a name, and a man turned that mockery into a revolution. One sentence. That's all it took. One sentence to change the world. But understand this, that one sentence worked because behind it stood a man who'd spent his entire life preparing to speak it, who'd built a foundation of struggle, sacrifice, an unwavering commitment to justice, who understood that words without action are empty, but action without words is invisible. Mandela gave the world both: the action of resistance, of standing firm against impossible odds, and the words to understand why that resistance mattered, why it was necessary, why it could never be surrendered. When young activists today ask how to fight injustice, how to resist oppression, how to stand against systems designed to crush them, the answer is there in that courtroom moment. Know your name, know what it means, know your history, your culture, your people. Then speak that truth with such clarity and courage that even your oppressors can't ignore it. Turn their courts into your platform. Turn their mockery into your power. Turn their weapons into yours. It won't be easy. It will cost you everything. It cost Mandela 27 years of his life. It cost thousands of South Africans their lives. It cost millions their safety, their security, their peace of mind. But the alternative is to accept oppression, to live on your knees, to let them define you, diminish you, destroy you, and that costs everything too, just in slower, quieter, more insidious ways. That costs your dignity, your humanity, your soul. So when you face your moment, when you stand before power, and power tries to make you small, remember Rolihlahla. Remember the troublemaker. Remember the man who turned a trial into a weapon with nothing but truth and dignity. Remember that the fight isn't about winning in their courts according to their rules. It's about changing the rules entirely. About building a world where courts exist to deliver justice, not to rubber stamp oppression. Where names are honored, not mocked. Where dignity is a given, not a prize to be won. That world doesn't exist yet. Not fully, not anywhere, but it's possible. Mandela proved it's possible. He showed us the crack in the wall, showed us that walls built by human hands can be torn down by human hands, showed us that one sentence, spoken with courage, can echo through generations, can inspire millions, can change the world. So the question isn't whether you have the power to change things. You do. The question is whether you have the courage to use it, whether you're willing to pay the price, whether you can stand unmocked in the face of mockery, unbroken in the face of oppression, unsilent in the face of those who demand your silence. That's the legacy of that courtroom moment. That's what Mandela gave us. Not a solution, not a blueprint, but an example, a demonstration of what's possible when you refuse to accept the terms your oppressor sets for you, when you claim your dignity as a right, not a privilege, when you turn their weapons into yours. The trial ended 60 years ago. Mandela has been gone for more than a decade, but that moment lives on. It lives on every time someone stands up to injustice, every time someone speaks truth to power, every time someone refuses to let their name, their identity, their humanity be mocked or dismissed or diminished. That's the weapon Mandela forged in that courtroom. Not a weapon of violence, a weapon of truth. A weapon that can't be confiscated, can't be destroyed, can't be taken away. A weapon that grows stronger every time it's used. A weapon that belongs to anyone brave enough to pick it up and use it. So, when you face your trial, when you face your judge, when you face the system designed to break you, remember, you have a weapon. It's your dignity, your truth, your refusal to accept that you're anything less than fully human. Use it, fight with it, change the world with it. One sentence at a time,